I did catch the tail end of John's presentation this morning, and a lot of those animals looked pretty familiar. I was involved with all of those shipments that we've actually sent out of Ohio, as well as the facilities here in Ohio and the Rickenbacker Air Park. So we're going to try to do this quickly. I'm going to try to show some pictures, but just to kind of show what happens on the federal side of a large animal export or a livestock export, or even if you're going to take your pet dog or cat overseas, you're going to have to come through or work with our office at some point. So topics to be covered, we're going to talk about how you locate the regulations. So say you do have a cow and you want to send it to Brazil for some reason, what do? We're going to briefly touch on the responsible parties and roles, who's involved with getting that cow to Brazil, the export certification process, and then what actually happens to get that animal onto a plane or a boat to get it to the foreign country. So the primary Bible for me is the Code of Federal Regulations, and if you have insomnia one night, by all means go ahead and pick up the Code of Federal Regulations and go ahead and read. But in particular, what the basis is for exporting any animal out of the country to another country is actually in 9 CFR Part 91, and this actually was just revised in February 2016 to actually include APHIS now has jurisdiction officially over animal semen, embryos, and other germplasm commodities, as well as dogs and cats. Prior to those regulations changing, we were the quote-unquote default agency that had oversight over those animals. Now we actually are able to by law. If you don't want to read the actual Code of Federal Regulations, and believe me, I've read it multiple times, that particular part, it's, again, if you have insomnia, by all means go for it. But we do have now available on our website a program handbook, which is kind of the shortcut guidance of what you would need to do in order to get an animal or a straw of semen or your bovine embryos to another country. So how do I get my cow to Brazil when I have it? Well, there's 3 ways in order to figure out what the regulations are to get an animal overseas. And I want to preface this by saying that ultimately that destination country is the one who sets the regulations to get your pet dog, your pet parrot, your chicken, your pig, your cow, your white-tailed deer. That destination country is going to determine what needs to happen. Sometimes they make scientific sense. A lot of times the requirements do not make scientific sense. If that country says that you must have a purple bow tie on the bull at the time you are collecting the semen, then by God there will be a purple bow tie on the bull at the time you're collecting the semen, and it's my job to make sure that that's on the bull when that semen is collected. So for those negotiated regulations, we do have a staff in Riverdale, Maryland, and it was my understanding that one of our senior staff officers was actually here last year to talk about the bovine semen industry here in the U.S. and how USDA works with that industry to get semen. But they also are the ones who individually negotiate country by country what it takes to get a particular animal over into that country. So when a country comes to us and says, by God, there will be a purple bow tie on that bull, it's our senior staff officers who will go to that country and go, okay, that's not exactly have anything to do with the health or quality of that semen. Maybe we can lessen it to this. And it's on and on process. Sometimes it goes very quickly. Sometimes it takes years for us to get a protocol negotiated. But when we do have it, we actually will post that on our website. So this website, link up here, if you just go to USDA APHIS, and then go to the import-export link, you can find the IREGs, as we call them, for animal exports. So if someone has opened up a market, or we've actually negotiated a protocol with a country, that information will be posted on this website. Currently, we have over 140 trading partners, and so we work really well with those 140 trading partners to try to get protocols that actually make logical sense, not only from a disease standpoint, but to help you as exporters get your commodities overseas to other countries. The second way, if we've not ever sent an animal to a country or we don't have necessarily a good trading relationship with that, is for the exporter to have their importer in that country apply and get an import permit from that governing authority in that particular country. It would specify the testing, the treatment, and any certification statements or health certificate that would be required to get that animal or that commodity into a country. We need to review that to make sure that we can actually make those certification statements or run that specific test or not run that specific test because the U.S. may be free of a disease, in which case we don't test. Just because a country would issue an import permit does not mean that we would be able to send those animals to that particular country. In the past 2 years, I've dealt with 2 different individual cases in which, one, I was working with an exporter that was trying to send 2 live Jersey cattle to a country in Africa, and the import permit said that we had to test the cattle for mad cow disease. There's no way we can do that and still send a live Jersey cow that can be milked. The other one that comes to mind is I've had import permits say that the entire United States is free of influenza. That would be domestic, wild animals, people, all species. Again, that's not something we can make, so we would go to the country and say, hey, we can say we're free of notifiable avian influenza, which right now we can't even say that, but we negotiate and help the exporter and the importer try to make import permits make a little bit more sense. The last place that an exporter can go is to our foreign agricultural services offices. USDA actually has personnel working in a variety of locations around the world, and one of their primary tasks, in addition to help act as a liaison between the United States and that country, is to help exporters get their products into a particular country. Stateside, it's also possible, if you wanted to send your pigs to China, to go to the Chinese embassy located in either New York or Chicago or DC, and they can help you get those pigs or tell you what is needed to get that animal to that country. Or you can contact the actual foreign agricultural ministry of interest. So if you were going to the United Kingdom, you would actually go to the Department of Environmental, Forestry, Regulatory Services, or DEFRA, and they would be able to tell you what is needed to get an animal or a commodity into that country. So who's involved with these? I know Mr. Serba talked briefly about the exporters, but there's actually quite a few people involved in getting an animal from the United States, or say here in Columbus, Ohio, to Rio de Janeiro. So first off, there's us, our agency, as I briefly touched on. We're the ones who actually negotiate with a foreign country as to what requirements need to be met. We're also considered the competent veterinary authority of the U.S., so if an importing country is required to have a health certificate issued and endorsed, it has to come through my office to get our sign and seal of approval before that animal can actually leave the country. We are involved in with what's called the USDA accreditation program. So for you veterinarians who are here in the audience, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. But the National Veterinary Accreditation Program is a program that we oversee, and we will actually certify and accredit private practice veterinarians to do work on our behalf. So if you are involved in any type of veterinary work on livestock or poultry or equine, then chances are you are a USDA accredited veterinarian. This means that you've actually taken additional continuing education courses, and in some cases special training in order to perform things like tuberculosis testing on deer or to take contagious equine metritis samples from horses. We also work very closely, as Dr. Good mentioned, with the USDA accredited veterinarian who will be performing all of the testing and treatment and vaccinations on that particular animal. So they come to us and we help them determine what tests need to be done, when it needs to be done, what vaccinations need to be done, or what type of facility requirements or approvals would have to be completed before that animal can actually go into an isolation. I, here in Ohio, work very closely with our Ohio Department of Agriculture Laboratory. On their submission form, they actually have a box that says export, and if any veterinarian actually marks that box for export, I get a phone call almost immediately when those samples arrive going, okay, this vet says this animal's going to Canada, what tests do we need to do? As we're going to see in a couple slides, countries can have very specific testing requirements. So just because they may require a brucellosis test does not mean that they will accept any brucellosis test that can be performed here in the U.S. They may want a specific one, like a standard tube test at a specific dilution, or a complement fixation, or if it's a different type of virus, they may want PCR on semen or a blood sample taken from the animal. So I help both the vet and the lab determine what testing needs to be met. Because the last thing I want is that health certificate to come into my office the day before the animals leave and I go, you have the wrong test, this animal can't go to whatever country it's going to. We work with people such as Mr. Serber, and he mentioned Larry Baker quite a few times. I've worked really closely with Mr. Baker on several exports. But we try to help make sure that those animals get to where they're going in a safe and humane manner. So we were involved in some of the designs of the export inspection facility that Mr. Serber had up there. I've met with the Rickenbacker Air Park several times to talk about how their staff can handle those animals, or what type of crates need to be done, or what type of loading equipment or transfer chutes. What's the best way to get animals into those crates and on an airplane in a safe and humane manner? The exporter is also responsible for all the financial end of things. So yes, it may seem really easy to put an animal on a plane, but it doesn't always sound as easy as it is, and it can be quite expensive. In the past, early in 2010, we had a cattle boom here in the United States where we were sending lots of bred heifers to Turkey and Russia. One of the exporters at one time told me that just to reserve the boat, not bring the boat here and actually put the animals on, was $5 million to actually reserve that boat for a period of time. So there's quite a lot of money involved in sending animals overseas. And again, I don't want to be the one to say, nope, that shipment can't go because you did the wrong testing. I do communicate sometimes with the importer, but the primary role of the importer is to communicate with their government. I, at my level, cannot communicate directly with a foreign government, although several have contacted me over the years. That's why we have headquarters staff in River, Maryland. So the importer is allowed to contact me, and I can forward those requests up to our headquarters staff. So I primarily act as a go-between between the foreign country and the United States. So what's involved with getting my cow to Brazil, for instance? I kind of broke the export certification process down into 4 steps, the first being the inspection and approval of a facility. A lot of countries, if you're reading through their requirements, will say that the animals have to be isolated for 30 days or 21 days or 60 days in a USDA-approved facility. This means that before those animals can enter into isolation, one of our staff would have to actually go to the farm and inspect that barn or that pasture or that warehouse that you plan on isolating those animals to make sure that it meets the requirements of whatever country you're going to. Not all countries require this. Some will just say if you're sending your horse to Canada, your accredited vet has to say a statement that they weren't on a premise that had contagious equine metritis. Fine. But for instance, some cattle, say going to Turkey, they specifically say that those animals must be isolated for a period of 21 days in a USDA-approved facility. If you see that, that's the first clue that, hey, you may need to have someone contact my office so we can make arrangements to see that facility. There are some other countries will just say that the animals have to be isolated in an approved facility or quarantined in a facility inspected by a veterinarian approved by the government authority of the United States. It's a lot of words, I know, but semantics mean a lot to me and words mean a lot to me. If that language is in there, and taking cattle to Brazil does have similar language, that means that the USDA accredited veterinarian can actually inspect and approve that facility before the animals go. If we're doing it, we have a standardized checklist, or a specific country may have additional requirements. New Zealand's a great one. They will say the animals have to be in a vector-proof facility, which means we're going to be looking for screening over doors and windows to make sure that no vectors can get in there and potentially infect the animals with blue tongue or EHD. And these are done on an export-by-export basis. So just because your farm or your pasture was approved this time around doesn't mean that the next time you go to isolate animals, it's automatically approved. We're going to have to come out, or the accredited vet will have to come out and make sure that that pasture or that barn is sufficient to isolate those animals. Once that facility is approved, the oversight of it does fall under the jurisdiction of the USDA accredited veterinarian. So it's on them to make sure that those animals remain isolated, that biosecurity is not broken, and that only animals that are fit and healthy to travel are going to be isolated in that farm and not come into any other contact. So what do we look for? General requirement, the first time that I walk onto a farm to approve one of these facilities, that facility has to be clean and disinfected and as free of organic matter as possible. I'm going in there to make sure if I can smell bleach or Virkon better, but I'm looking for things like leftover straw or puddles of urine or manure caked on the wall. I'm looking for things that could potentially transmit a disease to those animals while they're in isolation. If I find something, the farmer or the facility owner is going to be disinfecting and cleaning it again while I watch. We make sure that the animals are going to have adequate water, that the feed and the bedding are already present in the facility or in an isolated part away from other animals, that the facility has dedicated equipment, or if you can't dedicate your bobcat to clean out that facility because you need it in your milking parlor, that you have a protocol in place to clean and disinfect that piece of equipment before it goes into the barn. We look at drainage. We don't want it at the bottom of a hill where at the top your neighbor's cattle are up on that farm and then it rains in Ohio all the time and all that just drains right down into the building. And we want to make sure that those animals are isolated from any animals not in the shipment. So our general rule of thumb is they have to be at least 30 feet away. That includes air passages. So just because you may have multiple halls and a barn holding horses, and you have horses not isolated on this side, but horses isolated here, if I reasonably can think a fly can go over here and then fly over there and possibly bite one of my isolated horses, I'm not going to approve it. You have to have authorized staff. Ideas, once animals enter, they're not coming back out until they are actually being exported. So if something gets sick while it's in isolation, that may compromise the total isolation, but if something dies, you better call me. I have had animals die in between inject and read date on TB, which has its own unique challenges, depending on what country it's going to. And I have the right to come back and look there at any time. So just because the USDA accredited vet is overseeing that facility doesn't mean that I may not come back to make sure those animals are still in isolation. So once our animals are in isolation, we move into whatever testing and treatment is required by that country. So again, as I mentioned, this is determined by the importing country. For all livestock, poultry, and horses, it does need to be performed by a USDA accredited veterinarian. And those blood samples or fecal samples or PCR swabs need to be tested in a recognized established laboratory, such as one of our National Vet Services labs, a state diagnostic, or a university lab. You can't just send the swabs to your neighbor's garage and he holds the tube up and goes, yep, it's negative. That's not going to be acceptable for export purposes. So quickly, say I had this lovely Jersey cow and I wanted to send her to Turkey. This would be all the required testing and the specific types of tests, and it has lots of different dilutions in there, as well as maybe you can do pooled samples for PCR on BVD, or you have to have 2 bovine leukosis virus tests done. They're at least 30 days apart. So Turkey's pretty specific in the number of tests, the type of test, and when those tests are actually performed. However, if I was sending that same Jersey cow to Canada, there's a lot less testing. They, if you can see for brucellosis, are actually requiring different kinds of tests. When I was back here, it was just a serum agglutination or a complement fixation or FPA. But over here, it's FPA or standard tube test or plate test at 1 to 50 dilution. And then the blue tongue isn't required for every animal like it is for turkey. That's only required from animals originating from the state of Florida. So this is what I help the accredited vet do, navigate all of these tests when it needs to be done. And in a very large shipment, actually, I work with them to come up with a schedule because it's not easy to bleed and inject 3,000 head of dairy cattle for turkey, say. So we're getting closer to embarkation. This is when that health certificate gets issued. So a lot of countries on our website will have a very specific health certificate. Some require that you use our standard USDA form. And then we are getting more into the 21st century and actually are starting to move towards electronically generated certificates. When I say issuance, that's the day that the USDA accredited vet does the final examination on animals or germplasm or your dog or your cat, and then verifies that all testing and treatment and certification statements can be met. So this is the date usually of issuance is equal to the date of the last health examination on the animal. So this is hard to see, and this form's actually getting phased out, but for My veterinarians here, you may have heard of a VS Form 17140. This is our standard general large animal export form that can be used for multiple species to multiple different countries. This form is being phased out though, so everyone's really happy because you have to find a typewriter to type this form because it is a carbon copy 6-page form. And everyone laughs when I say typewriter. There still are 3 in our office, so it's not a completely foreign concept to me. There is something called a letterhead certificate, so these would be country-specific health certificates, and these are what's posted on our IREGs page. For instance, this certificate up here is a health certificate for exporting breeding cattle from the U.S. to Mexico. Mexico does require this form to also be typed. They also have their own little caveats where they don't like abbreviations, they don't like mistakes, and the certificate has to be in both English and Spanish. So to help all of you out, when we negotiated this certificate, we posted a fillable form on our website that you can type into and then print right out and sign. The last is our electronically generated, or VEHCS, which stands for Veterinary Export Health Certification System. This is a new system that we've been piloting for the past several years, but it allows an accredited veterinarian to actually digitally sign a health certificate and then submit it into an online system where we will then print it out and sign it in our office. So it saves a little bit of time. We tried to make these as foolproof as possible, so rather than typing in a bunch of certification statements or animal IDs or test dates, you can actually upload Excel spreadsheets or check boxes next to required certification statements. We're hoping that in the next couple of months we're going to go completely paperless with health certificates to Canada, where I will be able to digitally sign, and then that cert will get issued straight to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So there will be no paper traveling with the animal in a couple months for Canada. After you, as the accredited vet, actually issues and signs that health certificate, they need to give that to the original to our office in some manner, whether it's through appointment or FedEx or UPS or the VEHCS system, along with any required treatment records. So whatever is on that health certificate, whether it be a vaccination, a parasite treatment, or a test result, our office requires supporting documentation submitted with the health certificate. It's okay for the veterinarian to give us the treatment and the vaccination records as well as a TB test chart. However, any other required laboratory results have to be sent directly to us from the testing laboratory. So early on in the large shipments of cattle, when the accredited vet actually submitted those blood samples to the lab, they would actually add our email address on it, or my name and my email address, so that the results were getting emailed to me the moment they were left off so that I could start reviewing them. So what do I do on a daily basis? Probably wondering. I work with several people in my office called export document examiners. These are my assistants. When we get a health certificate into our office, the first person that gets it is our EDE. We have 2 of them in our office, so we're fortunate. But they check the license and accreditation status of the issuing veterinarian first. If that vet is not currently licensed in Ohio, or they are not currently accredited in Ohio, we go no further. That health certificate is null and void. They will then require to make sure we have all of our vaccination records, our treatment records. If we had to do a pre-export isolation facility inspection, they'll look for the signed checklist from the veterinarian who did that inspection. They will make sure we have all the supporting documentation we need in order to endorse that health certificate. They also will then go on to our IREGs. Everyone thinks we have a magical database that if nothing is there, they can call us and we'll be able to help them. Unfortunately, we're using the same website you all are. So sometimes I have additional information just from my past experience, because if it's can be exported, it has been out of Ohio, and I've probably been involved with it, but most often we're going to our website to look to see what's there. They will then give a certificate number, and then they prepare that with either my name or Dr. Karen Gruby's name, because we'll be the endorsing veterinarian for that health paper. So when I get it, I go through everything that my EDE has done again. So the main reason we do this is to have multiple sets of eyes, making sure that that paperwork is almost perfect. I'm a little bit of a OCD when it comes to paperwork, so things better be in the right order. Every period must be in the right place. Dr. Good can attest to this, because the last thing I'm going to do is sign a piece of paper for an animal I know is going to get stuck over in whatever country it's going to. So I seek near perfection when I look at a health certificate. because I hate getting those calls on Saturday mornings going, okay, our 150 head of white-tailed deer are stuck in Russia, what do we do now? Because I am the first person that exporter or that accredited vet comes back to try to get those animals released. I review every single lab test and every treatment record, every herd of origin for every animal that's on that health certificate, and it better match. So if the ID on the health certificate doesn't match what's on the lab report, I don't go any further until I figure out what the problem is. I will review import permits as long as they have an English translation. I can get through some French, but that's about it. So if it comes in Vietnamese or Chinese, I'm going to need an English translation to know what that document says. If after all of that everything's fine, then I sign the certificate and put our USDA seal on it. So what happens then? If it's livestock, equine, or poultry going by air or sea, it is required to undergo a final veterinary inspection by APHIS VEHCS. The exception to that is if it's going by land border with Canada or Mexico, because we have staff at ports on both sides. Either CFIA has an official or SAGARPA, as well as USDA, and we inspect them at the port at the time they arrive. But if it's going out of an airport, or it's going out of a seaport, or it's going further south than Mexico, it has to undergo a final vet inspection by us. That's in our regs. It's not always in whatever importing countries' regulations there are. We can only do those final inspections at approved export inspection facilities, and these are facilities that we've actually gone out and inspected and approved and have higher requirements than what an isolation facility has. They are always associated with an approved port of embarkation. So for instance, we would not be able to fly animals out of Rickenbacker unless we had approved export inspection facilities associated with those ports. So we approve where we're going to inspect, not the actual airport. Animals have to be kept at that facility for a minimum period of 2 hours. That's to allow adequate time for them to get feed, water, and rest. Since most of these animals can be considered prey, they tend to hide if they're limping or hide if they have a respiratory infection. So we try to calm them down so they're not so amped up on their own hormones and hiding signs that could potentially be a contagious or infectious disease. Kind of talked about that. So what do we look for? We're re-identifying all the animals. So we're comparing the animal ID on the health certificate to the actual animals that are present there for the inspection. We're making sure that they're free from contagious diseases and, as far as we know, exposure to a contagious disease, that they don't have any little critters hanging out on them that's going to take the trip with them, like a tick or a flea or anything along those lines. And then we're looking to make sure that the animals are not depressed, have no weird discharges, aren't lame, can see out of both eyes, make sure they're eating and drinking, and that they're not having things like diarrhea or reflux. So this may look familiar, but this is our approved export inspection facility down in Sabina, Ohio, with a group of beef cattle that were getting exported out of the port of Wilmington, Delaware. After we've inspected, we sign another piece of paper, Vet Services does, to show that all the animals have been given a careful veterinary inspection at the port of embarkation and are fit and healthy to travel as far as we can tell. And if we reject an animal because it's lame or it's got a respiratory disease or it doesn't have the right ID or it has pink eye or it has warts or open wounds that are bleeding all over the place, we actually will fill out a third piece of paper showing that the animal listed on the health certificate, because it has to be on an endorsed health certificate before it arrives at port, isn't making the trip and why it's not making the trip. So all those documents go with the animals to the foreign country and get verified by their port veterinarian to make sure that we've only sent them healthy and happy animals. Once we've completed that final inspection, those animals are under my purview. So I follow the animals to the port. I make sure they get loaded into the crates completely safely, nothing gets injured, that they either get on the ship or the airplane, and I am there until that ship or that airplane takes off. The reason being, if anything happens to one of those animals in the time that it gets loaded into a crate, or something happens and the airplane gets delayed for some reason, I can say that those animals remain isolated and didn't come into any contact with other animals. So just a couple examples quickly. These animals all were isolated here in Ohio and actually flew or went out by sea. This is one of our shipments from 2011. It was a group of cattle going to Turkey. There ended up being over 5,200 bred heifers on this ship. I think 3,600 of those were actually isolated here in Ohio. But we had, the trucks would come from the export inspection facility, and then they would load the animals up off these ramps, and we were able to unload back up 2 trucks at a time. And this is what the inside of that ship looked like. So it was actually just a converted cargo or a passenger liner that they converted into pens inside for the animals to take the trip to Turkey. It takes roughly 27 days for those animals to cross ocean to Turkey. And then this is a little bit different than the cattle that Mr. Serber sent this morning, but these animals were also isolated in Ohio going to Turkey, but they were actually kind of loaded on the plane in New York instead of here at Rickenbacker. But it just kind of shows, here's my happy Holsteins. And that's what the actual inside of those planes look like. So if I go back a couple slides, these blue items in the bottom are what we, at the airport, they call a cookie sheet. So those crates would actually get rolled onto those cookie sheets and locked into place. And there's the wheels on the bottom of those cookie sheets that actually follow the tracks in the plane, and then they will get locked in place on the plane. So it's not like the animals and cargo are rolling all around. They're actually locked in place to help those animals. And the animals actually stay surprisingly calm despite all of the noise and movement and going up in the air and whatnot.